Chapter 1. The Journey Home. The black SUV quietly rolled along the narrow dirt road, weaving through the fiery red maple trees of Vermont's autumn. The soft, late-afternoon sunlight filtered through the car window, casting flickering patterns on James Anderson's contemplative face. He lowered the window, letting the breeze carrying the scent of dried leaves and damp earth drift into the car. That scent was unmistakable, the scent of Evergreen, the small town he once called home. 16 years ago, James left Evergreen with nothing but a worn-out backpack and a heart full of ambition. He departed from Sunrise Home Orphanage, where Mrs. Eleanor, the woman who had devoted her life to raising orphan children like him, stood by the door, waving him goodbye. On that day, James carried with him a promise. "I'll come back, Grandma, when I'm strong enough." But time waits for no one. Life in the big city swept James away in endless deals and plans. He climbed the ladder of success, becoming the CEO of a leading tech corporation. Yet, even at the height of his career, every time he looked in the mirror, he still saw the eyes of the young James. Eyes that always gazed back at Evergreen, where warm memories of his second mother lingered. The news of Mrs. Eleanor's passing reached James on a freezing winter day. He was in the middle of a shareholder meeting and couldn't bring himself to abandon everything to return. Mrs. Eleanor left, taking a part of his childhood with her. Today, as Evergreen appeared through the windshield, James felt his heart tighten. Sunrise Home stood silently beneath the old oak tree, its walls peeling and windows sagging. It was no longer the warm and welcoming home in his memory, but a relic of time, forgotten in the heart of the town. James turned off the engine, sitting quietly for a few moments before stepping out. The sound of dry leaves crunching beneath his shoes echoed faintly. His steps were slow as he approached the old wooden gate, the same spot where Mrs. Eleanor used to greet him every afternoon after school. "I'm home, Grandma," James whispered, his voice raspy in the evening breeze. But this time, no one was waiting for him by the door. "Welcome to Soul Stories. Today we bring you a heartfelt tale. Let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to catch more meaningful stories." Chapter 2. The Encounter. James gently pushed open the creaky wooden gate of Sunrise Home, the familiar sound echoing softly. The scent of aged wood and the breath of time filled his senses, drawing him back to the childhood days when he and the other children ran and played in the courtyard. Though everything was now worn and faded, the warmth of the place remained, as if Mrs. Eleanor had never left. James walked down the long hallway, where the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden hue on the floor. His eyes swept across the corners of the living room, where children's crayon drawings still hung loosely on the walls. The messy yet innocent strokes made him smile unconsciously. As James stepped into the backyard, the sound of laughter filled the air. A group of children played around an old oak tree, while a small boy sat beneath it, nursing a scraped knee. Beside the boy was a woman with long brown hair tied neatly at the back. She wore a white blouse, carefully bandaging the boy's leg. Her face showed concentration, but also a gentle warmth, as if she had handled similar situations countless times. "Be careful next time, Tommy. No more climbing trees," she said, her voice soft but firm enough to make the boy nod obediently. James stood quietly by the doorframe, observing silently. There was something about this woman that brought a sense of peace to him, as if she were an inseparable part of Sunrise Home. Emma gently tied the bandage and patted the boy's head. "All done. Now go play with your friends." Tommy beamed a wide smile and ran off to join the others. Emma looked up, and her eyes met James, who was standing quietly in the fading sunlight. She paused for a moment, then smiled softly. "You're James Anderson, right?" James was slightly surprised but remained calm. "Yes, I'm James." Emma approached, her eyes bright but carrying a warmth and familiarity that eased the tension. "Mrs. Eleanor spoke of you often. She always believed you would come back." Emma's words tightened something in James's chest. Despite all the years he had been away, Mrs. Eleanor had continued to think of him. A mixture of regret and strange comfort washed over him, knowing she had never forgotten. "You know me?" James asked, his eyes carefully studying the woman before him. Emma nodded slightly. "Mrs. Eleanor showed me pictures of you as a child. She always said you were special. When you left, she kept in touch with you for a while, but in the last few years, she stopped mentioning it. Maybe she didn't want to burden you. James remained silent, unsure how to respond. His heart was filled with 100 conflicting emotions, memories and guilt intertwining. "Thank you for taking care of this place," James finally said, his voice low and sincere. Emma smiled gently. "I'm not just doing it for the orphanage. I do it for the children. And for Mrs. Eleanor." James looked deeply into Emma's eyes. He saw determination and genuine compassion, something he hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. "How is Sunrise home now?" James asked, his gaze shifting to the worn-down main building behind Emma. "To be honest, not great," Emma sighed, turning to look at the house. "Funds are running low, and the building is deteriorating. A few volunteers and I are doing our best, but it may not be enough to keep it standing much longer." James could hear the concern in Emma's voice. He looked at the house again, the place that had once been his refuge, and his heart ached. "How long have you been here?" James asked suddenly. 3 years, Emma replied. "I left a hospital in Boston to volunteer here. After Mrs. Eleanor passed, I couldn't leave this place. It feels like a part of me now." James watched Emma for a long moment. In the golden light of the evening, she seemed like a small but steady flame, quietly holding Sunrise home together, ensuring it remained a sanctuary for the children. "How long do you plan to stay?" Emma smiled, her eyes sparkling. "As long as I can." James nodded and his gaze softened. "Maybe I should thank you." Emma tilted her head, curious. "For what?" James chuckled lightly. "For staying." In the golden light of Evergreen, a quiet yet profound connection began to form between two people bound by memories and love for an old home. And in that moment, James realized he had found another reason to stay, beyond his promise to Mrs. Eleanor. Chapter 3. Sweet Memories. James walked slowly along the hallway of Sunrise home, allowing the old memories to naturally flood his mind. The soft afternoon sunlight filtered through the large window, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floor. Each of his footsteps echoed through the quiet house, as if the sound was awakening a part of his memory that had long been dormant. James stopped in front of the living room door, the place where Mrs. Eleanor used to sit and knit while the children played around her. Her old armchair was still there, covered with a white cloth, but its familiar shape was unmistakable to him. He stepped inside, his hand gently touching the armrest of the chair. For a fleeting moment, James could almost feel the warmth of Mrs. Eleanor, as if she were still sitting there, smiling at him. As his eyes scanned the walls, they settled on a small bookshelf where Mrs. Eleanor used to keep important things. On top of it lay a carefully sealed wooden box, painted in a deep brown color. Curious, James slowly lifted the lid. Inside were letters written in his own handwriting, neatly stacked and preserved with great care. James felt his chest tighten. They were the letters he had sent to Mrs. Eleanor during his university years, but he had never imagined she had kept them so meticulously. He pulled out the first letter, the childish handwriting still clear. "Grandma, I got into college. I promise I won't let you down." James smiled softly, recalling the moment he received his acceptance letter. It was the first time he had felt he had accomplished something meaningful, but also the first time he had left this home. The next letter was from the early days of his career. "Grandma, I just got promoted. I wish you could see me now." James flipped through each letter, and every line brought back a different phase of his life. Moments of success, joy, and the letters full of regret when he couldn't find time to visit her, not even once. But it was the last letter that made James pause. "Grandma, I'm sorry. I've been too busy, but I promise I will come back." James gripped the letter tightly, his heart sinking with regret. Why hadn't he returned sooner? Why did he wait until Mrs. Eleanor was gone forever to finally come back? The soft sound of footsteps behind him pulled James out of his thoughts. Emma stood there, leaning lightly against the doorframe, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. She seemed to know exactly what James was feeling without the need for words. "She always believed you would return, even when no one in this town remembered who you were," Emma said softly, her voice as gentle as an autumn breeze. James looked up, his eyes meeting Emma's. In that moment, no words were needed between them. James nodded, a faint but genuine smile appearing on his lips. She was patient, James said, his voice lowering but filled with affection. Emma stepped closer, her gaze falling on the letters in James's hand. She gently picked one up, her eyes scanning the heartfelt lines. She used to read these letters every evening before bed. She said every time she received a letter from you, it was the highlight of her day. James took a deep breath, trying to hold back his emotions. I should have come back sooner, James murmured, his eyes drifting toward the distant fields outside the window. Emma gently placed her hand on his shoulder, offering a comforting presence that warmed his heart. What matters is that you came back. James smiled, this time free from the weight of sadness. Thank you, Emma. They both sat down, sharing the small but memory-filled room. The old letters, the stories of the past, and Emma's presence made James feel as though Sunrise Home still carried life within its walls. And at that moment, James realized that his return wasn't just to fulfill a promise to Mrs. Eleanor. It was to rediscover the missing pieces of his heart that he had unknowingly left behind all those years ago. Chapter 4. Rebuilding a Home. The morning in Evergreen was fresh and serene. The gentle sunlight stretched across the maple trees, casting a golden glow over Sunrise Home. James stood on the porch, holding a cup of hot coffee, his eyes following the children playing in the small yard. After the previous afternoon, James had spent much time in thought. This orphanage wasn't just a memory, it was a part of him, a part he had left behind for 16 long years. He stepped into the living room, where Emma was carefully folding the children's old blankets. The light streaming through the window illuminated her face, peaceful and tender. Emma, James spoke, breaking the quiet atmosphere. Emma looked up, offering a soft smile. Good morning, James. Did you sleep well? James nodded, moving closer to place his coffee cup on the table. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. I've thought about this all night. I want to fund the entire reconstruction of this orphanage, James said, his voice calm but resolute. Emma paused for a moment. Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude but also hesitation. You know, I appreciate your generosity, James, but Emma hesitated. James raised an eyebrow. But what? Emma set the blanket down, leaning gently against the chair as she looked at him. Sunrise Home isn't just a building, it's a home for this entire community. We can't rebuild it alone. James fell silent. For the first time in years, someone had declined his financial help with such genuine sincerity. Emma, I can cover everything. We can have the orphanage repaired within a few months. Emma shook her head softly, her eyes warm but firm. I know you can, but if Sunrise Home relies solely on your money, it will lose its true value. The children here need more than just a new building. They need to feel the love and support of the community. James looked at Emma, and an unfamiliar emotion stirred within him. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. In James's world, problems were solved with money and influence, but Emma seemed untouched by such things. So, what should I do? James asked, his tone softening. Emma smiled, a knowing and understanding smile. Stay here. Help me and the others rebuild it together. James leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes contemplative. He hadn't expected Emma's request to be anything more than financial support. She wanted him to be part of this journey. Stay? James repeated, as if to confirm. Emma nodded. Sunrise Home needs more than money. It needs a helping hand, a presence. And most of all, the children here need you. James remained silent for a long while, his eyes drifting toward the window, watching the children laugh and play in the yard. Their smiles reminded him of his own as a child, sitting under the oak tree, listening to Mrs. Eleanor's stories. Suddenly he understood. I'll stay, James said, his voice steady, but you'll have to show me what to do. Emma's face lit up with a radiant smile. Deal. Emma led James through the orphanage, showing him every corner. She pointed out the leaky roof, the cracked walls, and the worn-out playground. Where do we start? James asked, his hand resting on the weathered brick wall. Emma shrugged. We start with the small things. Tomorrow we paint the walls. James chuckled softly. He was used to negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, but now he was being tasked with painting walls. The next day, James wore an old white t-shirt and jeans, holding a paint roller. Alongside Emma and a few volunteers, he began painting the walls of Sunrise Home. The children eagerly ran around, occasionally teasing James about the splotches of paint staining his clothes. "You're terrible at this," Emma teased, her hands skillfully rolling paint along the wall. James smirked. "It's my first time holding a paint roller. What more can you expect?" They both laughed, and James realized something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't success or ambition he had missed. It was the sense of belonging, the feeling of being part of something, like he was as a child at Sunrise Home. That afternoon, under the soft golden light of evergreen, James felt, for the first time in years, that his heart had found its way home. Chapter 5. Rallying the Community. A week after deciding to stay in Evergreen, James and Emma began planning the charity festival, The Journey of Love. Early in the morning, Emma sat in the small office of the orphanage, meticulously drafting a list of preparations. Beside her, James scanned documents on potential partners he could contact for sponsorship. "We'll need a lot for this," Emma said, glancing at the long list in front of her. James looked up, flashing a confident smile. "Don't worry, I'll handle the big sponsors from the companies I know. Can you manage the local efforts?" Emma nodded gently. "I'll do my best. Evergreen may be small, but I believe people here are always ready to help." Community outreach. In the following days, Emma began visiting homes throughout the town. Each morning, she carried her old medical bag, knocking on doors to provide free checkups for the local residents. From lonely elderly folks to mischievous children, Emma treated each patient with care and dedication. Mrs. Smith, an elderly woman living alone on the outskirts of town, grasped Emma's hand tightly as she measured her blood pressure. "Thank you, Emma. I wouldn't know how to manage this aching back without you." Emma smiled softly. "It's just a small thing, Mrs. Smith, but can I ask for your help with something?" "Of course, dear. What do you need?" Emma set the blood pressure monitor down, her eyes reflecting a glimmer of hope. "We're organizing a charity festival to raise funds for the orphanage. If you could bake some pastries or donate a few crafts, it would mean a lot." Mrs. Smith nodded without hesitation. "I'll get started. Those children are like family to all of us." James in the business world. While Emma focused on the local community, James spent his days contacting corporate partners in larger businesses. Sitting at his desk in the orphanage office, he dialed one number after another. "Mark, it's James Anderson. I'm organizing a charity event for the orphanage where I grew up. Can your company sponsor a food stall or some games for the festival?" The warm voice of Mark, a longtime business partner, echoed through the receiver. "Absolutely, James. We'll send over a food truck and refreshments for the event." As the days passed, the list of sponsors grew. Large corporations, from food companies to toy manufacturers, eagerly offered their support. James began to realize that even in the corporate world, compassion and warmth still thrived. An afternoon reflection. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the crimson maple trees, James stepped away from his desk for a walk around the orphanage. From a distance, he saw Emma sitting in the courtyard, surrounded by the children. She gently bandaged a small boy's knee while the others animatedly shared their stories from the day. There was a patience and tenderness in Emma's eyes that James hadn't seen in anyone else. He stood quietly watching from afar as a surge of emotion filled his heart. Emma wasn't just a volunteer doctor. She had made this place her home. Late-night work. As the warm lights of Evergreen flickered along the narrow streets, Emma returned to the office, finding James still immersed in documents. "Working late?" Emma asked, setting her medical bag down on the desk. James looked up and smiled faintly. "I want to make sure everything's perfect. This event is important." Emma sat across from him, her eyes softening. "Thank you, James. Without you, I don't know if this orphanage could survive." James shook his head lightly. "It's not just me. It's us. I'm just a part of this journey." For the first time, Emma felt a warmth and sincerity from James that she hadn't noticed before. She looked into his eyes, seeing a man who wasn't just here out of obligation, but because he cared deeply. Festival preparations. A few days later, Evergreen's town square buzzed with activity. White tents lined the streets, and stalls filled with homemade crafts, baked goods, and toys appeared. People from all over town gathered, carrying small items to contribute to the event. James strolled through the festival grounds, greeting each vendor with a nod. "James, it's been a while since I've seen you here," Mr. Thomas, the town's bookstore owner, said, clapping him on the back. James smiled. "I figured it was time to come back and do something meaningful." Emma joined him, holding a checklist for the final preparations. "We're ready," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. As James looked around the bustling town square filled with laughter and life, he realized the festival wasn't just about raising funds. It was about rekindling the spirit of community, a bond Evergreen had always cherished. And within him, a new home was slowly being built. Not from bricks and mortar, but from the shared love and compassion of those around him. Chapter 6. When the Heart Speaks. The sky over Evergreen sparkled with stars that stretched endlessly like a shimmering blanket. The peaceful night was accompanied only by the soft whisper of the wind rustling through the old maple trees and the faint hum of crickets in the small orphanage garden. James and Emma sat on the orphanage steps, their eyes following the children inside as they drifted into sleep. The orphanage had begun to take shape. The newly painted walls still carried the faint scent of fresh paint. Emma rubbed her hands together to ward off the cool autumn air. James noticed and silently took off his jacket, gently draping it over her shoulders. "Thank you," Emma whispered, leaning slightly against his shoulder. "Have you ever thought about staying here longer?" Emma asked, her voice blending softly with the tranquil night air. James remained silent for a moment, his gaze distant as he looked up at the starry sky. After a few seconds, he smiled. "I never thought about it until I met you." Emma turned to face him, her eyes shimmering under the soft light of the stars. A warmth blossomed inside her, making her heart race unexpectedly. "I stay here because of the orphanage, but you don't have to," Emma said, her voice lowering as if afraid to disrupt the quietness of the moment. James gently shifted, his eyes searching for hers. In that brief instant, the space between them seemed to disappear. James softly took Emma's hand, his grip tightening slightly, as if wanting to hold on to this moment forever. "I'm not staying just for the orphanage. I'm staying for you," James said, his voice warm and sincere. Emma couldn't hide the surprise in her eyes. She looked away, her cheeks flushing, but a subtle smile played on her lips. "I didn't expect you to be this straightforward," she said with a quiet laugh. James shrugged, his gaze still fixed on her. "Sometimes there are things that can't wait." The two of them sat in silence. But it wasn't the awkward kind. It was a peaceful quiet, the kind where hearts could feel the unspoken words between them. "Emma," James's deep voice broke the stillness. "If I stay here, do you think we could continue rebuilding Sunrise Home together?" Emma glanced at him, her eyes soft but filled with a warmth that felt comforting and familiar. "I think nothing would make me happier." James smiled, pulling her closer. His hand intertwined with hers, feeling the comforting warmth that radiated between them. "Tomorrow we'll continue, won't we?" James asked, his eyes full of hope. Emma nodded, her eyes gleaming with quiet determination. "Yes, this place still needs us." Beneath the blanket of stars, James and Emma sat together, finding the peace they had long sought. Sometimes love doesn't come from grand gestures, but from simple moments like these, where two souls connect amidst the laughter of orphaned children and the worn walls of a cherished old home. And in that moment, James realized that Evergreen was no longer just the town he grew up in. It was where he found family, love, and his true self. Chapter 7. Rebirth. The morning sun shone brightly over Evergreen, casting soft golden light across the maple trees. Sunrise Home was now filled with laughter and joy, no longer the quiet and desolate place it once was. The charity festival, the Journey of Love, had been a tremendous success, raising enough funds to kickstart the orphanage's reconstruction. However, a significant portion of the funds came from a large contribution by James. Yet at his request, the donation was credited to the community, reflecting a collective effort rather than the generosity of a single wealthy individual. James sat on the orphanage steps, watching volunteers work diligently. Emma sat beside him, her hands busy organizing the newly delivered materials. "I think we're almost there," Emma said, her gaze fixed on the playground taking shape. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sunrise Home is my home," James said softly, his eyes distant. "I don't want people to think this place was rebuilt by an outsider. This is the home where I grew up. If anyone should take part in rebuilding it, it should be me." Emma looked at James, admiration shining in her eyes. "You never thought of yourself as an outsider, did you?" Emma asked gently. James shook his head with a faint smile. "Number Sunrise Home gave me everything. Shelter, Mrs. Eleanor's love, and the lessons that shaped me. I'm not just some rich visitor returning to help. I'll always be part of this place." Emma smiled, sensing the deep connection James had with Sunrise Home. "So, you want to keep everything simple? As part of the family here," Emma said softly, her voice full of understanding. "Exactly. Sunrise Home doesn't need someone watching from the outside. It needs people who stay, who contribute," James replied, his eyes lingering on the children playing beneath the large oak tree. Building together. In the following days, James fully immersed himself in the reconstruction efforts, joining the volunteers to paint walls, lay bricks, and rebuild fences. Each morning, he and Emma walked through town, reaching out to residents for their support. "I grew up at Sunrise Home," James told Mr. Thomas, the local bookstore owner. "It's time I give back, but I hope everyone can pitch in a little." Mr. Thomas nodded, giving James a firm pat on the shoulder. "You don't need to convince us, James. Everyone in this town remembers you. You've always been part of Evergreen." James and Emma worked side by side every day, from clearing the playground to fixing the leaky roof. Occasionally, the children would join in, helping James paint the gate or arrange chairs in the classroom. During lunch breaks, they sat under the oak tree, sharing simple meals Emma had prepared. James found himself savoring every moment, as if each repair brought him closer to rediscovering the life he had left behind. "I never thought I'd return like this," James said quietly, his voice thoughtful. Emma looked at him, her smile soft and reassuring. "Sometimes the path home isn't what we expect, but what matters is that you're here and you're staying." James smiled, his eyes warm as they met hers. The day of reopening. On the morning of Sunrise Home's reopening, the townspeople gathered in full force. Long tables were filled with pastries and fresh juice, prepared by the mothers of Evergreen. James and Emma stood in front of the orphanage, where a new sign had been placed: Sunrise Home, a house built by the heart of the community. Emma stepped onto the small stage, addressing the crowd below with a voice full of emotion. "Today, we don't just celebrate the rebirth of an orphanage. We celebrate the love and unity of this community. Sunrise Home will continue to be a place of shelter and warmth, thanks to each and every one of you." James joined her, his gaze sweeping across the familiar faces in the crowd. "Sunrise Home was once my home. Now it's the home for these children, and I hope that every one of you will always feel like part of this place." The crowd erupted in applause. Children rushed forward, wrapping their arms around James and Emma, their eyes sparkling with joy. A quiet moment. As the day wound down and the townspeople began to leave, James and Emma sat quietly on the orphanage steps, gazing at the lights twinkling inside the newly restored building. Emma leaned her head against James's shoulder, her voice soft as a breeze. "Sunrise Home is ready for a new beginning." James gently took her hand, his eyes distant yet content. "And so am I. Thank you, Emma, for reminding me that I belong here." Looking up at the starry sky, James smiled softly, whispering to the wind, "Grandma, I did it." A gentle breeze passed by, as if she were listening. "Sunrise Home has been reborn. The children have a place to laugh and play again, just like I once did." James bowed his head, resting his hand on the old oak tree, feeling as if he was touching a piece of the past still lingering. "I know you always believed I would return, and I kept my promise. I'll stay, because this is my home, just like it's home for the children who remind me of myself." In that moment, James felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if Mrs. Eleanor was smiling somewhere, proud of the boy she had raised. Are you still following our story on Soul Stories? Comment Coca-Cola to let us know you're still here. Chapter 9, A Promise Under the Evergreen Sky. The afternoon in Evergreen unfolded in gentle hues of sunset. The last rays of light draped over Sunrise Home, casting a soft glow that reflected through the freshly cleaned windows. The children ran across the grassy yard, their laughter echoing through the air. James stood by the old oak tree where Mrs. Eleanor used to tell stories. His eyes followed Emma as she knelt on the steps, tying a young boy's shoelaces. A breeze rustled through, lifting her brown hair gently over her slender shoulders. James walked toward her, his heart swelling with an indescribable feeling. He sat beside Emma, watching her quietly before finally speaking. Emma, have you ever thought about staying here forever? Emma looked up, slightly surprised by his question. Her eyes softened, curiosity flickering within them. I think I've always been here, James. James smiled, his hand gently finding hers, giving it a soft squeeze. I mean, staying here, but not alone. Emma raised an eyebrow, but a soft blush crept onto her cheeks as she caught the meaning behind his words. From his pocket, James pulled out a small box, flipping it open to reveal a simple yet elegant ring that shimmered in the fading sunlight. Emma Carter, you helped me find myself again. You reminded me that Sunrise Home isn't just where I grew up. It's family. I don't want to leave this place, and I don't want to leave you. Will you marry me? Emma froze for a brief moment. The nearby children, sensing something special, suddenly fell silent, their wide eyes fixed on the scene before them. Emma looked at James, her eyes sparkling in the golden light. Are you sure, James? There's still so much to do here. James nodded, sincerity filling his gaze. I'm sure. I can't imagine being anywhere else. And I can't imagine life without you. Tears glistened in Emma's eyes as she nodded softly. Yes, James. I'll marry you. A round of cheers erupted from the children as they rushed forward, wrapping their arms around Emma and James in celebration. A few months later, on a bright summer afternoon, James and Emma's wedding took place in the small garden behind Sunrise Home. Emma wore a simple white dress, holding a bouquet of wild daisies, her radiant smile outshining the sun. James stood beneath the oak tree, the very place that held so many memories for them both. The entire town of Evergreen gathered, from Mr. Thomas, the bookstore owner, to Mrs. Smith from the bakery, as well as the workers and volunteers who helped rebuild the orphanage. They weren't just guests, they were part of the large family Emma and James had created. As Emma approached James, she whispered, I never thought I'd have a wedding here. James smiled, holding her hand tightly. I can't imagine a better place. They exchanged rings beneath the oak tree, with the children as their witnesses, children who had become their family. James didn't return to the city after the wedding. Instead, he chose to spend most of his time in Evergreen, managing and caring for Sunrise Home alongside Emma. Every morning, the two would walk the children to school, take them on nature trips, and organize outdoor activities. James even began teaching the children about technology, hoping to inspire them the same way Mrs. Eleanor once inspired him. The townspeople grew accustomed to seeing James, no longer as a distant businessman, but as a true part of Evergreen, a man who poured his heart into Sunrise Home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James and Emma stood watching the children play in the yard. Emma gently rested her head on his shoulder, her voice soft. How long do you think you'll stay here? James smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. I'm not planning to leave. Sunrise Home is my home now, and home is where you are. Emma squeezed his hand gently, feeling a warmth spread through her heart. Beneath the sky of Evergreen, a new family had truly formed, not just from love, but from compassion and the bonds of those who had come together to rebuild this home. James realized that sometimes home isn't where you're born, it's where your heart leads you. It's the place you know you can always return to, no matter the circumstances. Thank you for following this story. Please rate the story